Good day, and welcome back to the Queer Pridecast. More than 4 in 10 Americans say that they personally know someone who's transgender. That still leaves a majority who don't, and for them, the news does the introducing. So, what is the news actually telling them? For years, that question ran on hunches. My guest today set out to replace them with data. Kae Petrin is a data journalist and media educator. As a co founder of the Trans Journalists Association, they helped build the Trans News Initiative. This tool has analyzed more than 190,000 news articles about trans communities. It looks into 5 years of coverage sorted out into clear patterns. Kay has called the Trans News Initiative a mirror for journalists. In this episode, we look into that mirror together, what it reveals, and what the headlines keep missing. Kay, welcome to the Queer Pridecast. Welcome to the episode. Good day.
Good to see you.
All right. So I'll just ask you my first question. So you co-founded the Trans Journalists Association back in 2020, right? And the initiative grew out of that work. So what was the thing that motivated you to build this tool? Like what spurred you to realize that there is a problem in the lack of data?
Yeah. So a lot of our work at the Trans Journalists Association involves having conversations with reporters and newsrooms who are trying to cover trans communities and aren't totally sure that they're getting everything right. And they're, dealing with a lot of misinformation and disinformation and trying to figure out how to report on it accurately and responsibly, et cetera. And one of the things we kept hearing in our conversations was when we have a conversation about what journalists are and aren't covering, how are our editorial priorities, focusing on certain sorts of stories and missing others. A lot of the times we would sort of describe what we were seeing in the coverage as people who read it all the time because we're doing trainings based on it. And sometimes the reaction from newsrooms would be, well, who says? Where's the data on this? Where's the proof? And so we really wanted to be able to move from our own sort of anecdotal, here's what we read, here's what we see, to a much larger scale view of the way that coverage is focusing its energies and the way that journalists are focusing on specific stories over time.
So you described this initiative as a mirror for journalists, right? So I'm really curious because I saw in the findings that there are more pop culture coverage than stories about resilience, resistance, and solutions. What did you think about that? Like, why are journalists or why does the media cover more of these types of stories rather than the stories I would say that really, I guess, more, I wouldn't say interesting, but more important, I would say?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big and complicated question because it gets to the root not just of the problems with covering trans communities, but like our whole, media ecosystem right now. And I think part of it is that genuinely there are more like pop culture publications and like when you think about what are the outlets that like aren't folding, what's quick and easy and like what are people reading, right? Entertainment coverage is still a huge area. And like there's some really good, really smart, really nuanced entertainment coverage. And there's also just a lot of stuff that's like, what are people mad about this week? Right. So part of it just shows us like that reality of the media landscape right now, which is that there's a bunch of like low effort, pretty like financially successful sort of for-profit media companies that like make a lot of their money off of entertainment journalism. But I think it also speaks to a larger bias in the sort of like priority and focus and framing of trans communities, which is that there's all of this culture wars coverage. And that's what we see in a lot of the pop culture coverage. So when you look at what are the top sort of clusters of events that are being covered under pop culture, it's not like, oh, there's a TV show that we all love or there's a cool play. The top events are J.K. Rowling and controversy over anti-trans statements that she has made. It's controversy over Dave Chappelle making anti-trans jokes in his comedy specials. And the framing on those stories is very culture wars focused. It's sort of like framed as a free speech issue or a censorship issue or a sort of like the woke left is angry issue. And it's not really substantive because there are real stories under, for instance, the role that J.K. Rowling has played in funding anti-trans legal work in the United Kingdom. One of the other really big pop culture bubbles is the Bud Light controversy, which involved a bunch of people boycotting Bud Light because a trans model represented the brand. And there was sort of like a anti-Bud Light, we're anti-trans boycott. And then trans communities didn't like Bud Light's response to that. So then trans communities and LGBTQ allies also started boycotting Bud Light. And so like there's this huge blow up around it. But if you look at a lot of those stories, it's framed as like exclusively, again, this culture war coverage, rather than looking at this is like actually a huge complex sort of economic and sort of business story about what's going on in this situation, right? But the framing became all about the sort of pop culture elements and the culture war elements. And so I think that's a lot of what we see is that these sort of like easy narratives and easy framings of two people are mad at each other or two sides are mad at each other really dominates what the stories journalists are telling and the perception of like what audiences are reading. And, whether or not that's true, it's driving a lot of the coverage. And you end up with this sort of preponderance of culture war stories rather than stories that are looking more concretely at like what's happening because of legislation, who's funding these changes, even the more economic or sort of substantive stories about the role that, J.K. Rowling, Dave Chappelle, Bud Light, and some of these large corporations and large, like very wealthy people may have on what's happening in everyday life for the average person, right? Those stories sort of get pushed aside in favor of these, two people are yelling at each other framings.
So when you presented this to the journalists you talked to, what was their reaction? Did they sort of realize a hidden bias in how trans people are being covered in the media? And I don't know, did some people say that this is what people want? These are the stories that people read. So these are the type of stories that we give them.
I mean, I think anyone who's coming to me is sort of pre-filtered, right? Because it's somebody who looks at this and says, I want to get this right.
Yeah.
And so I don't get a lot of the like, well, this is just what the people want, right? But what I do get is a lot of people saying, I understand that these stories are important. I want to tell more substantive and investigative stories. I want to follow the money. How do I convince my editor that it's worth the time or that it matters? And so there's a lot more, I think, like I've heard that journalists are often using these data points to say, hey, look, this story isn't in here. We're not telling this story. And they're using it to convince someone up the chain who might not believe them that like there is a good sort of editorial justification to spend time on something that their bosses might not necessarily see value in from a journalistic perspective. And so that's more of what we've heard is that there's less, like it's not blowing anyone's mind, I don't think, in the sense that like we're not seeing people look at it and go, oh God, I never knew this was happening, right? A lot of the people who are looking at it are like, I knew this was happening and I needed the evidence to show that to someone else who, isn't looking at these tools, isn't as familiar with these spaces. And it's helping me make the case to them that we need to tell these stories differently.
So do you think the editorial decisions are made in light of the current political situation in the US? That these people, do you think that they're more afraid to have more substantial coverage because of how political powers have sort of declared war on the community?
I mean, there might be some of that, but I'll be honest that I haven't, like no one has expressed that to me in the rooms that I've been in, right? But what I do hear is I think a lot of journalists, really pride themselves on like sticking it to power, right? That's what a lot of us at our best, whether or not we're actually doing it, we're thinking like, oh, we're gonna hold the powerful accountable. We want if the government's doing something wrong, we want people to know about it. That's a lot of the ethos that people are thinking with. I think where we see a lot of the disconnect with the sorts of stories we're telling about trans people is that there's this mentality that trans people are only 1.5% of the population, according to common statistics. As a data person, I'm not sure that's actually, I think that number is probably low. But like, there's this idea that, okay, we're a tiny subset. A lot of people don't know us. There's this sort of latent idea that we're not in your communities. We're not like real people, and that these laws only affect us, which means the stories might be relevant to at most 1.5% of my audience, because there's this perception that only trans people care about news about trans people, and that these stories, these legislative attacks, these political efforts are only relevant to trans people. And even if you're being like incredibly cynical, that's just not true. Because when you look at what these laws do, They're really expensive. They're really disruptive. They're hard to implement. You have stories that have been done here and there in states like Indiana and Florida, looking at like how much sort of administrative chaos some of the education laws, for instance, have caused, and how expensive and burdensome it was for the schools to even figure out, like, what do we do about this new law? It introduces a whole bunch of huge privacy issues. We could get like, we could be violating federal privacy laws. Like, how do we deal with this, right? And so that's an issue that even if you only have one kid in your school district, even if you have 0 kids in your school district, the school administration still has to respond to this new legislation. And that takes time and resources, legal consulting. And then the process of like implementing something can get very complicated, et cetera. And so like there's this idea, that, there's only 5 trans kids competing in school sports in this state. So it only affects those 5 trans kids. And it's like, no, because it's a law that affects 500 school districts, whether or not they have a trans kid on a sports team within them. And so I think there's this idea, right, that like it's niche community news that's only relevant to one audience, and that audience is tiny. So why would we tell the story? And the reality is that's just not, it's a total misunderstanding of how these laws operate and the sort of impact that they have on everyone who may be reading your newspaper, your publication, your newsletter, whatever.
I know that you only assessed how the US media covered trans stories, right? But you also managed to pick up international threads in a way. Like I remember you had something about the US Marine killing trans woman in the Philippines, and also American groups funding anti-gay laws in Uganda. So what did it tell you about how American media frames trans stories beyond the US? Did it reveal something insightful for you?
Yeah. And that's our sort of transnationality section of the analysis, where we really just looked at like what stories is the US media publishing about what's happening globally. So yeah, it is interesting because I think we mostly see some of these like big legal cases like the US Marine killing a trans woman and in the Philippines, and like what the consequences of that became, how like there were a couple publications following that sort of whole case over time. But a lot of it does seem very focused more on like individual people and individual cases rather than really zoomed out transnational cross-border journalism, which is interesting to me. When you go into more global investigative journalism spaces, there are a lot of conversations about like, how do we put heads together between journalists from different countries, and like, money's going from one country to the other to fund XYZ. How do we track that? And you see a lot of that journalism happening in very important spheres, like in particular, like warfare, disinformation, and information operations to sort of change public opinion about wars.
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of that sort of journalism around like politicians and like what money are they spending? Like how are they embezzling? Like what companies do they have ties to internationally? You do see a lot less of that coverage broadly on LGBTQ issues that really zooms out and looks at like trends. How are these US think tanks influencing, not just the legislation in Uganda, but there's actually a lot of these, if you poke around a bit, like US Christian organizations that are building international communities that are pushing legislation all over the world. And that's been documented in some places here and there, but you really don't see like a large volume of big picture lenses on how much that sort of activity is happening and what sort of influence it's having, even though that's something that we're doing in other spheres of journalism. And so the thing that it really like emphasized to me is that if you sort of speak about like the LGBTQ beat generally, is that it's like we have all these tactics for telling these higher powered, like bigger picture, high context stories, but you just don't see as much of that happening when the stories are conceptualized as an LGBTQ community story. And you end up with this focus on like very specific people or very specific events rather than like, how are all these things, there's a massive global refugee crisis right now, and like queer people and trans people in particular like tend to just disappear into these systems or like not, or be denied at the borders. And there's like some stories about asylum claims, right? But that's an area where you're really not, again, like we have it here and there about like a trans woman being denied an asylum claim in Australia, or about sometimes trans women being arrested on suspicion of being sex workers when they're just going on vacation and they've got a 2-week visa, things like that. You see like singular instances of that, but you don't see a lot of the like, how often is this happening? How many countries is it happening in? Like, what are these sort of intersections in this like whole global world, right? Those stories just aren't happening as much for LGBT communities.
Essentially, no one is connecting the dots. Like they see these as individual events like happening everywhere, but no one is really connecting the dots and like the patterns and the trends that are currently,
Yeah. And there are stories that do that, but I think the thing that our tool really emphasizes, that the Trans News Initiative looks at things where like it's been covered more than 10 times, right? So you do have, these one-off stories, but they're not getting like picked up and retold and republished in the same way that these more like those connect the dots stories they're not traveling as far, basically.
So what do you think about when the news sort of gives equal importance to both sides, like sort of like treating both like sides as equally important? Do you think that's a problem? Like, how can journalists do better on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about like the concept of both sides. But I think the really big picture issue that I run into with that sort of coverage in the US is like often when someone's coming to a story about trans communities and thinking, okay, there's two sides here. It's Democrats and it's Republicans. I get a politician from each party. They each give a quote and then we're done, right? Really often those stories are not useful at all. Like they're not talking to the Republican who wrote the anti-trans bill or actually understands what it does. They're not talking to Democrats who've read the bill and understand what it does. It's just two people saying what they think about something. And like, I think there's a world where you could have a story where you just quote a Republican on something and you just quote a Democrat on something and you move on. But like, they do really have to be the right people who actually understand like the policies and their complications. And I think a lot of the bigger picture, like large scale issue with this both sides framing is that like, even if you're thinking of journalism that way, like a lot of these stories are not even getting the two people who actually know what the issue is. And like we audited a bunch of coverage outside of the Trans News Initiative. And one thing that we did see is like, even if you're saying like, okay, we're taking this massively simplistic view of what journalism is, and we're doing this, like you quote one person from each side model, we were also seeing that Democrats were quoted way less frequently than Republicans. So there were a lot of stories that were just like based on Republican politicians saying things about the bills that weren't even accurate. Like it wasn't even reflecting the language of the legislation that they were themselves passing, right? And so I think like there's sort of two pieces to this, which is like even if the both sides is the starting point, like a lot of outlets are not even doing both sides. They are just doing one perspective and moving on. And then when we're doing the sort of both sides approach, like the people actually have to know what the policy does and like explain it to people. And the journalism is just often not doing that. And then like going beyond that, I do think that simply framing these stories in terms of there's two political parties and they each get to talk is a real misunderstanding of what the news even is and what's even happening, right? And so I think you really have to broaden your lens on who your sources are in terms of you got to talk to trans people for starters, because we're often most affected by this legislation. But you also have like whole networks of communities affected, parents of trans people, larger LGBTQ communities, families, sports teams, right? Like you kick a kid off the sports team, that has an effect on the whole team, the whole vibe in a school, right? So there's these bigger sort of like network pieces of people affected by these decisions that their voices are not being heard. Trans people's voices are not being heard. And, I think we just miss a lot of the nuance and the understanding of what's actually happening because, politicians are writing these bills about biology and science, and the information in them is not correct. It's just simply literally not what anyone has, like, it's not what the scientific literature has said for decades plus. And so if you don't also go find someone who is not just a random doctor, but specifically an expert in sports medicine, or specifically an expert in like research on what, biological sex really is and how complex that is. Like, you're not getting accurate information because often the politicians don't understand what they're writing the legislation about to start with. So it does, I think, there's a number of layers of issues with the both sides framing, but the really big picture is it just doesn't inform people because there's really usually not two sides who really actually understand what you're talking about on some of these more complex stories that deal with health policy, science, biology, what's going on in schools and how school curricula work. Like, all of that is much more technical and complex. And you really need experts who actually work in those areas if you want the person reading your story to understand really what's going on. So,
why do you think this happens? Does it speak about the competence of the journalist to seek out actual experts? Or
I think this speaks. Sorry.
No. I was going to say, is it also about the current news cycle? The journalist has to churn out an article in a matter of hours. So they just don't have the time to seek out the experts that are needed to interview.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors, right? Because I think you do genuinely have bias where people just aren't familiar with our communities. They make assumptions in the coverage and they don't ask the sort of follow-up questions that they should be asking. But I also think, it is also a part of the problem with that is it's hugely related to the pressures of the 24/7 news cycle. Editors are just get me a story. Some people are, obligated to write 7 stories a week or 7 stories a day. And if you're covering something that you don't already know much about and you don't have time to do your research, you don't have time to do a training, your professional development budget has been cut, so you can't go to a panel about it, right? There just isn't the time or resources or investment to get this right. And part of that's investment in our communities and coverage of our communities specifically. But part of it is also you see less and less investment in journalism itself, within newsrooms, within the broader, people are paying for news less often, or the ways that people are paying for news is really shifting. Everything is consolidating, and the consolidations are firing people. There are fewer and fewer people. We're expected to cover the news the same amount. There's more news. We're expected to cover more news, honestly. And so as much as there is this sort of journalists don't know enough about our communities and that leads to mistakes, oversights, and bias, there is also just this reality of journalists don't know enough about anything in some cases right now. I was trying to write coverage guidance for how to cover legislation about trans people specifically. And I wanted to find a 101 guide to state house coverage, right? How do you show up at a state house, listen to a hearing, read through a bill? What do you look for? What are the questions you ask yourself? Where's a 101 guide or a 101 resource to this, right? Because it's not you do something special when you're covering legislation about trans people. It's the exact same thing that you do anytime you go do state house coverage on any topic. You talk to the politicians, you talk to the experts, you assume the politicians probably don't know what they're talking about and may not have even written the bills themselves. You go talk to the people who actually handed them the bill language, right? All that stuff. It's not just on, trans community coverage. It's the same process for covering climate, for covering local government, everything. And so I was where's a resource on this so people who aren't familiar with the process can learn more about it? Because a lot of what we see is for instance, LGBTQ beat reporters have never worked in a traditional newsroom where they are going to a state house and doing that sort of coverage. So they need a primer, right? Versus the reporters who are in state houses and know what's going on. They don't know as much about trans communities, right? So it's we're educating different people on different things depending on where the gaps in their knowledge is. I could not find a single 101 resource about how to cover a state house. And I texted a friend who's been doing state house coverage for decades. And I was is there where did you learn about this? Where do you is there some organization that teaches people how to do this and I can link them to it? And she was no, it was an apprenticeship model. You would go to a state house. There'd be a senior state house reporter. Even in the smallest publications, you'd have at least 2 people in the state house and you learn from the reporter who was 65 and had been doing it for 40 years. And that person isn't there anymore, right? They fired everyone and you've got one 25-year-old who doesn't know what they're doing, going to the state house and trying their best in some of these especially small local publications, right? And so you kind of have this model where it was okay, you were learning how to do this by observing, by being in a traditional newsroom. by having an older coworker who told you how it works. Nobody wrote down how does this work step by step for everyone to reference.
Nobody bothered to document it.
Right. So there's no documentation, and now everyone has retired or been fired or taken a buyout, right? So it's like, it is these like much bigger industry issues where you sort of see how bad they can get and how bad the consequences of that sort of undereducation can be when you look at the trans coverage, but it is happening on so many different beats too.
So as a last question, what is your hope for this initiative? What do you plan to do out of it? Do you also hope that it will get picked up by other countries, that they would also start assessing how trans people are being covered in their specific countries? What do you plan to make out of it?
I mean, we've actually already had some conversations with people, particularly in the UK, who are interested in trying to do something similar. That would be very cool. I think broadening the sort of, what stories are we telling question is always good. Also just open in general, like sparks conversation around what are we prioritizing and like what aren't we seeing in this data set, right? And it would be very cool if we could see versions of similar analysis that looked at like different topic areas. I'm very curious about actual like meta level disinformation coverage, misinformation coverage, and what that looks like in other countries. And then I think like, when you look at the way legislation is moving, there's so much happening in Latin America. There's a lot of like really good African investigative journalism coming out of a couple like specific outlets that are writing about LGBTQ issues right now. And it would be very interesting just to see like how the volume stacks up and what sorts of stories are being told, more broadly. And the source tool that we use to do this actually does have media collections from all over the world. So like, it's very doable. We just don't have funding to do more of it ourselves. So, but it would be very cool. I think one of the things that has really opened up is a conversation also with folks in other media environments who are just trying to figure out like, how do we change the sorts of stories that are being told? And are there ways that, this tool doesn't look different? Like the questions it asks needs to look different in every single country or every single media environment. Even just if we do another version update, which we're hoping to do, of looking at how LGBTQ media covers trans communities and how different that looks from sort of the mainstream, large, longer, lasting like newspaper world that we looked at with this initial analysis, right? Like we may have to think differently about how we design something that looks at LGBTQ media coverage patterns. And so all of those things, I'd love to just see it grow. People to use it as a template. People to be like, this sucks. Let's do something better. I have a better idea, right? And I hope it might also spark thinking on similar like ways of telling stories about the stories we're telling on other topic areas too. Like not just that it will stay locked into analyzing trans coverage, but like these methods are replicable. The data source we used is really accessible, very well documented. Like I hope people will think about ways that this can tell them about like what local news stories on all topics they're missing, or like use it to pull data on how they're covering ICE and other topics. So, I've spoken at a couple of conferences just about how people can adopt this sort of thinking and technical tool set in general.
Thank you, Kae. Thank you. That has been a very insightful interview, and best of luck on the initiative. And I do hope that other countries adopt the idea.
Yeah, thank you for having me on and for the smart questions.